are the Advocacy Fellows, heroes voicing for and empowering young adults with learning disability.
So tell me what it was like growing up with autism.
You don't know any different because you've always been autistic. That's the way you were born, isn't it? So you don't know what it's like to not be autistic. So that's a pretty tricky, open-ended question, isn't it? Which is one of the difficulties in communication, is that when questions are open-ended, there is so much information that could be answered that it's hard to know which bit to answer, isn't it? So you find it much easier to have a closed question or a very specific question so that you know which part you're needing to be answering. Would that be right?
Yeah.
So in terms of what it's like to be autistic, that's a really hard question to answer, isn't it? We live in a world that is built for neurotypical people, and so other people don't necessarily understand. You don't understand what it's like to be neurotypical, and other people don't understand what it's like to be autistic. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And so in terms of communication, neurotypical people have a particular way of communicating which is very different to an autistic way of communicating. And in an autistic way, it needs to be, and you prefer it to be direct and concise, don't you? Which to people that are not autistic, they can often think that comes across as rude or blunt, don't they? And so quite often people will think that you are rude or blunt, when actually you're just being honest, or you're just stating a fact, or you're just telling the truth. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
And the other kind of differences within non-autistic people and autistic people is that you experience the world in a very different way when it comes to the environment and your senses, and so that you feel things in a very different way to non-autistic people. So things like lights and lots of noise and kind of just everything in your day-to-day world. If there's too much of that stimuli coming in, that becomes a bit overwhelming sometimes, doesn't it? And so you need time away from people and lights and noise, and time to regulate yourself. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, sure.
And should we go on and talk about like the PDA profile that you've got? Shall we first of all explain what that stands for? So PDA stands for pathological demand avoidance, which is probably not the best wording, I would say, because that suggests that you avoid demands, which you do avoid demands, but it's not the demand that is being avoided as such. It doesn't really matter what the demand is. It is an anxiety response to being asked to do anything. So it doesn't matter, even if it's something that you enjoy doing, that you like doing, that you want to do, it's your brain triggering anxiety as soon as you're asked to do anything. Would you say?
Yeah, sure.
And so as a coping strategy, you need to feel like you're in control and that you have autonomy, and because that keeps you safe. All the time you know what's happening and you can predict what's happening and you are in control. That means that you're safe, and that keeps your anxiety low, doesn't it? So there's a really nice phrase, instead of pathological demand avoidance, which sounds not very helpful, people often say it's a persistent drive for autonomy, because you always need to feel autonomous and that you're in control to feel safe. And so even in this situation, me asking you to answer questions, you'll find them really difficult, aren't you? And being sat here with a camera in front of you, and it's that expectation. As soon as there's an expectation on somebody on you or somebody else with PDA to do something that instantly triggers an anxiety response, a fight or flight or freeze. And at the minute you're in freeze, because you can't really respond, and you will, so when we first arrived in the room, you didn't want to come in the room, and then you did come in the room, but then you used your phone as a distraction, and then if someone asked something, you felt like you couldn't answer. So it comes across that you're just ignoring people, which to other people comes across as really rude, but for you it's because you've got so much anxiety that's been triggered that you can't. So it's not a won't or a choice, it's you physically can't do that because your body, your brain takes over and doesn't allow you to do the things that you want to do. Do you think that explains that?
Yeah.
In terms of when you're in that fight or flight situation, if you was in an emergency situation, Aiden, how would you like to be spoken to by the fire service? If you was trapped in a car or you was in a building and they needed to support you, how is the best way for them to do that, do you reckon?
What, to speak to me? Tell me everything that's going on. What's do we say?
Yeah, but that's a really important point, isn't it? So if you need to know what they are expecting and you need to know how they're going to help you. So they need to be able to verbalise that and tell you exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think it's a really important factor within anybody that's autistic, but especially somebody with PDA. There has to be a reason to why somebody is doing something. If there is no reason, or you see no reason, or you see no purpose, that makes it even harder for you to carry out that demand or request. So it's really important that they explain to you everything that is happening and why it's happening and what they're expecting you to do. But do you remember the other part that we talked about in terms of perhaps if they needed to physically help you in some way? Like touching you, or what would be really important if somebody needed to actually come up to you and physically move you?
To tell me what they're doing.
Because again, when we talked about the sensory system, you find it really hard for people to be in a close proximity to you. And so if somebody was just going to come in and manhandle you and move you out, even though they think they're helping you or they think they're getting you out of a really dangerous situation, that would instantly make that fight, flight, freeze happen. And in that instance, it would probably be fight and you would probably lash out. Yeah, so they're coming in to help you, but you might, because you've been triggered by somebody touching you and you weren't expecting it, you might suddenly lash out. And that would obviously escalate a situation. And you're not doing that to be unkind, you're doing that because that's a response that your body makes. So that's a really important point, that they talk through everything really, really clearly. And I think the other part of that we talked about in the car was about just an expectation to answer a question is enough to trigger that fight, flight, freeze response, because you can't answer a question in the moment. So when a fireman is talking to you, they need to be able to talk in a way that doesn't warrant an answer, which is very different to how perhaps their general work would be. They'd probably be all right, mate, what's your name? And that's an instant demand. And that will instantly trigger you to shut down because they're expecting you to say what your name is. And they're trying to get information out of you to see if you're okay or if you're hurt in any way. They're doing their job, they're not doing anything wrong, but that will trigger you to shut down. So it's important for firefighters to know that if they can talk in a way that doesn't need an answer, but they can just be there to explain and reassure, then that would be really helpful. If Aiden is asked to do something that's instantly really difficult, but Aiden has one speed, and that isn't because he is being purposely slow or rude or trying to be a rebel, which is what we're often, we joke about. It's actually because Aiden is assessing the whole situation. There is a demand on him, there's an expectation to leave, which has triggered that fight, flight, freeze. So you will hold back to the very, very last minute before you actually do something. And I think, like you're saying, if it's an emergency situation and everything is going at a very fast pace, that will be really, really difficult for you, because there is no autonomy there. There is, this is what you're going to do, and you go and do it. And someone else is enforcing that on you. And it's your instant response is to hold back and, yes, I'll do it, but I'll do it in my own time when I've assessed the situation and there is really no other way out of it. So I think that is important to know.
Yeah.
So if you were to be in an emergency situation, quite often other people perceive that risk as very high, rightly so. Aiden would not necessarily perceive that as a high risk, because often you think you're invincible. Would you say that's fair? And often he perceives that other people will move out the way, for instance. So if a car was coming down the road and Aiden's crossing the road, Aiden's instant response would be, well, he can see me, he's got eyes, and I'm in the road, so therefore he will stop. So it's a different way of thinking, which other people wouldn't necessarily understand, and could sometimes potentially, put you or other people into that kind of dangerous situation. And a typical person's response is to do things quickly and safely and in an organised manner, but that's very expectation and demand heavy, which you would be triggered by. So that again is an important thing for other people to understand, why you may be behaving in that way, or why you may be holding back or not responding instantly to somebody's request.
Yeah.
What does it feel like, Aiden, when somebody asks you to do something, like without giving a reason or without explaining why you have to do something?
Oh,
Can you explain what that feels like inside you?
no, not really.
So when, let's take it out of an emergency situation, when Grandad asked you today, when you came round, can you move the pot for me in the garden?
Yeah.
Did you instantly jump to that and go and do it? Of course I can, Grandad, I'd love to help you. Is that what you said? No. What did you do?
No. What did I do?
You didn't answer him, and you walked really, really, really slowly to the garden. And you were hoping, I think, that I would probably go and do it for you. Did you think that would be right?
Maybe.
But that isn't because you didn't want to do it. That's because
It didn't need doing. More to
okay.
the point.
Why did it not need doing?
Because Grandad doesn't need everything doing when everyone's around it. Things don't have to be done right that minute.
Okay, so you would happily do it, but in your own time.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point. You would do it in your own time, because that puts you back in control, and that gives you the autonomy to be able to get through and stop that anxiety being triggered.
Yeah.
So I think one of the biggest elements within autism, but highly indicative of a PDA profile, is the need for equality, and in order to get that kind of equilibrium between people. So in Aiden's world, everybody is equal. There is no hierarchy. There is, he couldn't care less whether you were talking to the Prime Minister, to a police officer, to a 4-year-old child. Everybody is treated equally in your view, aren't they? That's how you see the world, and that is why trust becomes such a massive has such a massive influence on you being able to connect and build relationships with people, because it isn't about where they are in a hierarchy of our society. It's about whether you trust somebody, and that's how you enable relationships and connections to be built. And so if you're in an emergency situation in a typical world, the majority of people would trust the firemen that are coming through the door to come and save you, and you wouldn't necessarily automatically trust somebody just because of their job title or their position. You would need that relationship first. And that's why communication in those situations is so key, and that somebody is consistent and they are clear and concise and direct, and they enable you to feel safe. That's a really important part of PDA, because everybody in your world is completely equal, and you don't feel that instant power push. And so somebody has to earn their trust and earn their respect to be able for you to trust them, don't you? That's a really big, important part for you. As soon as somebody loses that trust with you, or they lose your respect, then you can't have a relationship with them, can you? And they lose that respect by not being consistent, not doing what they say, doing one thing, saying another. People have to do what they say and always stick to that, don't they? And so in an emergency situation, that's really important, that someone's able to kind of get that rapport with you, and you trust them in order to be able to not be triggered in an anxiety way, to then do the demands that are asked of you. And I think that's important to kind of know. I mean, even in our own family situation, there are certain people that Aiden can cope with demands from or expectations from, because he has got that relationship with them, he trusts them, there's a connection there. And there are other people that he can't, and that instantly triggers that anxiety response, doesn't it? And an anxiety response doesn't look like anxiety, does it? An anxiety response can look like fighting, shouting, swearing, disassociating, ignoring, distracting yourself, being rude. It doesn't necessarily look like someone quivering and shaking in a corner, which is important to say.
Aiden, tell me about your achievements.
I've got loads. Means I've done my level 1 surf coaching, qualified surf coach, and qualified beach lifeguard, co-steering instructor, set up my own business called Aloha Keku, and I work for a company called Coastal Crusaders.
What's one of the things that you do with Coastal Crusaders?
A project called Seated Surfing for people who can't surf. And we just put them in a seat and take them surfing.
Why can't they surf?
Depends.
Give me some examples.
Paralysed, strokes.
And what about your Aloha Key surf club? Can you talk about that?
Surf club for learning disabilities.
And who set that up?
Me.
What does Aloha Kika?
Hello, welcome, and inclusive and inclusion.
And why is it important to have a learning disability surf?
Because there aren't any surf learning disability category in surfing.
So if you wanted to compete in surfing, you can't compete at the moment because there isn't a category for anybody with a learning disability, is there? So you're hoping that you can get some competitors. Don't train them too well because they might beat you. And then you can have surf competitions with other people that have got a learning disability. And hopefully that will happen all around the world, and then you can travel to. Where do you want to travel to?
Hawaii.
You have a surf competition in
We'll
Hawaii.
go back to Australia.
That's an awesome goal, isn't it, to aim for?
This video was produced by Discover Voices, part of Disability Cornwall and Isles of Scilly, To check out all of our content, simply search Discover Voices on YouTube.